Gray Space Podcast.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luke, and welcome to the Gray Space Podcast, the place for discussions of all things intriguing and esoteric. Now, in this episode, we're going to be discussing Her, the film Her. So if you haven't seen it already, make sure you watch it. It's a very interesting movie. If you don't mind things being somewhat ruined and you haven't seen it, well, then by all means continue and then watch it afterwards. Now, we're going to be getting into things from more of a mythological, psychological, and even philosophical perspective. The person I'm talking with today is Matthew Lewis, and I just want to make a very quick disclaimer for those of you who are coming here from the Joker episode. This is not a Joaquin Phoenix themed channel. So I just want to make that very clear. This happens to be another Joaquin Phoenix movie. We're going to be discussing lots of other interesting things in the future, movies, TV shows, and more. So just wanted to clear that up for anyone who might have that in the back of their minds. And without further delay, let's get into the conversation. You texted me today and mentioned that you had some new ideas. And so we've been, just to sort of give this a little bit of context, we've been going back and forth on ideas around and behind the movie Her. And for anyone watching, if you haven't seen Her, don't listen to this and don't watch it because it won't make any sense. But it might be a good idea to watch the movie before and then listen to it, or then watch this. That might be a good idea. So if you haven't seen that, go watch it. It's a very interesting movie. But you had texted me in our most recent conversations about your thoughts in relation to Jungian ideas. So I thought maybe we could start with that stuff. We could get into some of that stuff. Maybe overall impressions and also nods to Jung, or maybe things Jung related. I know you say Jung. I can't not say. I say Jung because that's just how I've heard it. Is that wrong?
I'll ask my German friends.
Yeah, please do. Seriously, that's something I'd like you to do, because I've always felt that it should be Jung for some reason, and I don't know why I think that. But if that's wrong, when people say things the wrong way many, many times, like data, I can't stand when people say data. It's a major pet peeve. And so if I'm doing that, then that bothers me, and I'd like to be corrected. We were talking about in the movie how the main character has a kind of masculine, feminine oneness. In a way, in some characteristics that he has. But you brought up the idea, the concept of the Anima, but then recently, just today, you texted me about something that transcends that.
Yeah, so I can break down the animus a little bit for anybody who hasn't been exposed to that idea. And I actually have to, well, according to Jung, I should talk about the shadow first, because he would talk about that. And basically, the shadow is whatever part of your own personality. And according to Jung, it's the same sex. So if you're male, then your shadow is male. If you're female, your shadow is female. And the shadow is basically all the things that you have to subdue about yourself and push down into the unconscious. So say if you grow up in a specific religion, there's a lot of thoughts or ideals or modes of emotion or ways of thinking that you have to push away. And what Jung says is that the shadow is a natural thing and it needs expression. And what happens is, at some point in your life, after pushing these emotions and thoughts down and down and down, they're going to seek to erupt into consciousness. And these are things you're not supposed to do, right? So it's going to be a violent eruption, and not necessarily physically violent, but it could be emotionally or psychologically violent. It causes neuroses and causes you to go to the therapist and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And incorporating the shadow it seems a little bit like mindfulness, in the sense that you recognize, okay, I have these thoughts or these feelings, and while I've taught that they're evil, how do I sort of recognize that, wow, those things that I don't like are actually in me. And it's not that they shouldn't be there. It's just that, how do I not let them overtake me, or give them sort of a release valve as though they're not necessarily evil, but they're there, and that's fine.
In Jung's bio, he talks about how he started having conversations with his anima, or the feminine part of himself, and at first she was a sort of commentator on what he was writing. She would say things to him internally, and then eventually he incorporated her to the point where he wasn't able to make the distinction between her voice and his own voice. It was just sort of a blended mode of existence. Do you remember that part?
I don't.
Yeah. Unless I'm losing my mind, that would be a weird thing to remember or make up. It seems to be.
Sounds legit.
It's his experience of integrating his anima, although he didn't call that the shadow.
Right, and they're different.
Yeah.
So, I just brought up the shadow first because, in his version of the psychoanalytic process, you have to deal with the shadow first, and then when you've sort of incorporated whatever part about yourself you don't like, then you get to the animus layer, and what the anima and animus are specific to the sex of the patient or the person. So if you're male, you have what's up?
So shadow is ground level, and anima and animus is sort of a subdermal, and then your personality is the epidermis, basically.
Yeah. So personality, shadow, anima, animus.
Oh, animus is below shadow in the levels.
Right. Yeah, but it doesn't sound like it has to be a good evil, the anima animus. It's just, you can't start to see the animus until you can see the shadow layer and sort of understand what the shadow is, and then you can see what the anima animus is.
Okay, so exploring the shadow is sort of like developing night vision in a sense, and once you develop night vision, you explore the shadow, then you're able to sort of make out shapes around you and figure out what constitutes your deeper personality.
The anima is a male's total sort of subconscious idea of the feminine, or of woman, and the animus is a female's projection or ideal of what the man or the male would be. And so then a man or a male's, the way he constitutes his anima, figures out what it is and develops it subconsciously, is first inspired by his interaction with his mother. And then for the female, the animus is described or defined by her interaction with the father, because that's generally the female's closest male influence. For the male, his anima is built on the foundation of the collective unconsciousness. So the male's idea of the feminine is imprinted, is hardwired into us biologically and psychologically, which is kind of the same thing, for as long as human beings have existed. So that perception of the female is built on that level, sort of the ground level, and then the specific anima is a compensation for what is or isn't experienced by the male of that subconscious foundation. If the anima, sort of this universal mother, feminine, female image, exists and it's a totality, well, your mother can only express part of that. She's not every single woman. She's her own individuated person. But the male has this ideal, this compensating ideal of what a female should be. So when he grows up and he's looking for a mate, he will project that ideal of which is the anima onto different females around him. And he'll have this ideal and these assumptions of who that female is or isn't, which is the animus.
That makes it sound like it's a built-in dating app. That's what that sounds like.
Yeah, maybe so. That's pretty good.
But you're not talking specifically about finding a significant other. You're talking about a persona within yourself, a part of your persona. It doesn't have to be projected onto another real person, does it?
It's an idea and an ideal that you have in yourself, what he means when you project it is when you project that idea onto somebody else and then they don't live up to it, then there's this cognitive dissonance and this problem. And, the marriage or the relationship breaks down, that kind of thing, because this person isn't living up to what you expect. And what you expect is based on your prior experience with your mom. And then that further back is based on the subconscious, the total feminine and the subconscious. Does that train follow?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Let's try to bring it back to the film. Maybe you can talk about how that sort of the totality of what you've explained then kind of relates to the protagonist of the film, Theodor.
Yeah, so
Arthur.
The male has this ideal of what a female would be, and that's the anima. A female would have what she would have, the ideal of the male would be called the animus. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Theodor in the movie, he's dealing with this subconscious projection or ideal of what a female should or shouldn't be. And how do we know that? How do we know that this movie is even talking about Jungian ideas in the first place? So when he goes and he buys the OS and he takes it home, he installs it on his computer.
We don't know that he bought it. Might have been a free download.
It could have been freeware. And so he's installing it on his computer. It's installing, and then a voice comes on and it says, what does he say? Like, would you prefer the operating system? It's a male
voice, and then it asks him a series of questions.
Yeah, and one of them is, well, would you prefer your OS to be a male voice or female voice? And he says female, and then
basically it says what things are missing from your projection of the anima. That's basically trying to profile it.
Yeah, how can we compensate for what you're looking for?
Yeah.
And the second thing was, I think, do you consider yourself social, or I don't think he says introverted, but Theodor says, I think social. He says he feels like he's social. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that question is a good clue that we're talking about Jungian ideas, because Jung splits people or categorizes people under two main groups, the extroverted type and the introverted type. And so that first question is essentially categorizing Theodor as an extroverted or introverted person. And then the third question that the OS asks is, how is your relationship with your mother?
Mm.
And so, why would Siri or Alexa or whoever, Cortana, ask you, how's your relationship with your mother?
None of your business, Google.
Yeah. And so then Theodor starts to answer, and he says, I think it's pretty good. But actually, one thing that annoys me about her is when I start to ask a question, she automatically makes the answer about herself. And then rather than letting him go further in an explanation, the OS just says, thank you. Like, that's
right.
Enough. We don't need to know anymore.
The fact that you're elaborating is maybe the answer to the question, or that you would want to elaborate. And maybe just saying yes or no would be another answer. So it's looking for the subtext of the answers, not looking for the specific answers. Some things are yes, no. Do you want a male voice or a female voice? The interesting thing I think there is it's not trying to create an ideal partner for him necessarily. It's trying to create the ideal person to handle his daily tasks. This is not a dating app. Not everybody dates their OS. In fact, I think it's kind of a rare thing, right? And he's not looking for a partner. He's not looking for someone who doesn't physically exist, right? So his answers are of the purest form, because if it were a dating profile, that immediately puts you into a different mode of answering, and then it wouldn't give him maybe the real person who would become his compensating anima figure, right? He's just answering the questions. He doesn't have any real intentions. He seems kind of not confused, but sort of amused when he's answering the questions. He's not thinking, "Oh, geez, what kind of woman am I looking for?" Because those answers might be very different, and a lot of people don't know how to verbalize what kind of person they want to be around, right? But it's sort of,
because it's subconscious.
Yeah, it's subconscious. So if those were the questions, then the answers would probably come out a lot different, and he would probably end up with the phone slut lady who he calls the day before, because that's what he maybe on the top of his brain thinks he wants, but the context was shifted, and so it didn't play out that way, and so he got what he was actually looking for subconsciously.
What he got was a compensation for the things he needed, in the sense that, the OS is supposed to, we can guess that the OS is supposed to help you or assist you to do things, to accomplish things. And Jung would say that the anima is essentially our subconscious idea of who or what would compensate for what we're lacking.
What's that awesome Jung quote where he says, usually the things we don't like or the things that annoy us about others are the things that we don't like in ourselves, or something like that? Yeah.
Or the things that we don't allow to exist in others are the same things we don't allow to exist in ourselves, and it's like the same.
Well, it's the things that we don't like about ourselves, not don't allow. Things that are buried deep that we hate about ourselves, that we've pushed way, way down, that we don't even acknowledge, are the things that piss us off about other people.
Yeah. So it seems like that's a case for Samantha, the OS, who is formulated based off of his questions. It seems like that's the case for us to think, okay, we're dealing with Jungian ideas, so we can bear that in mind,
right,
as we're watching the film, and specifically the animus idea.
Well, but what about his character specifically, though? I mean, there is the comment later made by Star-Lord,
Chris Pratt.
Yeah, Chris Pratt. That, well, okay, so he's a man who has an ex-wife, but in his mind he's still married. He hasn't signed divorce papers. So why hasn't he signed divorce papers? Because he says it. I like being married. And the thing that made him, basically, that put him in the situation of being a divorced, technically married man, is that he wasn't able to recognize in himself some of the things that maybe he should have changed as his wife developed as a person. So she's changing over time, and he's stuck in some kind of stasis field and not able to recognize what those characteristics are. Not necessarily childlike or immature, but he's kind of frozen in this state of being a married man and thinks, okay, maybe once I'm here, I don't move forward anymore because this is, I grew up with this person. I don't have to worry about it. But she was busy improving herself, right? So there's this character of him being someone who maybe sees himself one way and is actually another way. But then also you have the other sort of dynamic in him is that he writes these beautiful cards. He writes, which is maybe something we can talk about more later. He writes these beautiful really well-written, handwritten cards for other people, not for himself. And sort of, I think the comment there is he wouldn't be able to write one for himself because he's not able to penetrate within himself and see how he might write a card for himself. He eventually writes a card at the end of the film. Basically, that's his card that he writes for himself and to sort of complete the story of him and his wife. But as a person who always looks out, he still has he sort of has the ability to do it, but is in a sort of, I don't know if it's in a masculine way, refuses to do it. So he has the feminine characteristic of being someone who's able to write very tender, very compassionate cards, but has the stubbornness for himself that maybe is I guess the more masculine tendency. And I don't know if it's very strictly a masculine feminine characteristic thing, but then later on, Star-Lord says to him, I always forget Chris Pratt's name. Some people, I can't remember their names. There are certain people, and I just can't remember what their names are. Chris Pratt. John Oliver is another one I always forget. I just want to call him Oliver. I know that's wrong, so I usually just say the host of Last Week Tonight, and I always
Is
forget.
that because he's English and you think of Oliver Twist?
I don't know. It's hard. I'm not able to look into myself and see what's wrong with me.
Maybe if you wrote a letter.
Maybe if I wrote myself a bullshit Hallmark card, I'd figure it all out. Chris Pratt's character tells him directly that he has very masculine and feminine sort of characteristics, because you'd have to have the more, you're like a guy and a girl at the same time, because you have to be very sensitive in order to write that sort of, to empathize to that degree, to be able to write those sorts of cards. So I think that's an interesting dynamic within himself, and I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, it seems when it comes to that idea of masculine, feminine, and these overarching sort of mythic traditional ideas about it, the male idea is order and hierarchy and that kind of idea, and then female is more relational and interconnectedness. So, I mean, that would make sense. Chris Pratt's observation that there's a man and a woman inside you, and that's a compliment. He pats him on the shoulder, and he says that because it seems like Theodor can look around and see people's relationships. I mean, there's that scene where he's walking around with Samantha, his OS, in his pocket, and they're talking about the people around them that they see in relationships, and they're making judgments about, oh, what's going on between these two people? They look like they're in love. Oh, no, this is a new relationship. Those aren't her kids. Those are his kids, and she's just happy that she's not dating an asshole finally once in her life, that kind of thing. So he's perceptive to those
very
qualities.
Perceptive. Yeah, very sensitive. Yeah.
Yeah, on the outside, but like you said, he can't see inside of himself. He hasn't come to grips with his own transition, in a sense, because that's part of that thing I was going to tell you about today, but we won't get to it. We'll get to it in a second, I guess. But then,
why won't we get to it? Where I didn't get the memo. Won't get to what? We'll get to it.
It's good. It's good stuff.
Well, just say it.
Okay. All right. Because so we're talking about essentially. So he's going through a divorce, but he doesn't want to sign the papers. And then he's all bummed out and lonely. He listens to melancholy songs on his iPod.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, in the refrigerator, in the elevator, he says, like, "Can you play something melancholy?"
Yeah.
And then, a great hipster track starts to play. And then he's not dating anybody. He just can't get past this.
But he still has the physical urges. He does. I'm surprised by the comeback of, what are those calling services called? I can't remember what those are called. I used to see ads for them on late night TV where you'd call some lady, and then it would be sort of
900 numbers.
It's a thing where you basically have phone sex with someone, essentially. Yeah, and they talk to you for $45 a minute. I haven't tried it.
Money well spent. Maybe you should.
It's interesting that it comes back in the future, because I don't even know if it exists anymore. Maybe I don't watch TV, so maybe it does. But
I thought it was just a chat room where people go. It wasn't necessarily like a escort prostitution or pay for service.
She's getting what she wants out of it as well. It's a mutual thing.
Yeah, that scene is hilarious.
It is. It's very funny.
What a wonderful shift in tone.
Yeah.
So that idea that I read about yesterday is Jung's idea of the contained and the container. And it was the next chapter in that book that talks about shadow, the anima, and the animus. And I almost didn't read it because I thought, this is short and it's not going to be that pertinent, but it's 1,000% pertinent. So,
would you say that it's hella pertinent?
Yeah. So Jung talks about this idea of midlife, and around midlife, that there's this division where you transition from focusing on these biological urges to focusing on these spiritual urges. And he talks about this transition within the realm of a marriage and relationships, specifically marriage.
What were you reading exactly?
I think it's called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship.
Okay.
And it's from his collected works. And so he talks about, the first, up till you're about 35 or 40, the first part of life, the whole marriage idea and ideal is built around these biological urges, and they're largely subconscious. And the whole marriage routine and institution has been instituted to sort of guide and direct those unconscious urges in a socially acceptable and fruitful way.
Yeah.
So around the age 35, that's when people start to realize, oh man, the end's coming. It is coming. And you look back on your life and look back through living under the sway of all these subconscious urges. And at about the same time, you're starting to get this inkling of not necessarily you're becoming conscious of what you've been doing and why you've been doing it. And at the same time, the actually important things are starting to emerge. So you're not
spiritual needs.
Right. So you're not doing things out of a subconscious drive. You're starting to become conscious of it, and you can take more agency and become more honest with yourself about what you really want. And in a marriage, that transition can wreak some havoc. There's a conflict and a change that has to be reconciled and dealt with.
Your wife doesn't like your new speedboat. She gets pissed about it.
Yeah.
I know we don't live near a body of water, but I like it.
Yeah. So let's get serious, Luke. Stop making jokes.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just trying to alleviate the monotony, sir. Monotony. I mean, continue. Sorry.
That's why you and I talk about these things. Apollo and Dionysius.
Okay. So
I'd definitely be Apollo.
Okay. So what are you trying to say? What are you saying?
So in the movie,
as he takes a sip of Southern Comfort,
we haven't even talked about
puts a laurel on his head.
That's a great segue into the Greek aspect of the movie.
Okay, but first, I want to mention something, because I've been reading Masks of God by Joseph. Is it pronounced Joseph Campbell? How do you say it?
Goseph.
Goseph Campbell. And I just got through a part that tracks that as well. So he's saying, in a lot of traditions, it's the middle of life that's the most monotonous sort of functional part of life, where personally you're taking care of the spiritual needs, but that's also the period of your life when you're productive, quote unquote, contributing to society, adding to the value of your community or whatever you're doing. And then it's on the two ends of the spectrum where all of the interesting spiritual stuff happens, where it's the elderly who take care of the rites and rituals and initiations, and they're sort of in charge of that, not because they're old, but because they've had to have that reckoning with themselves, and they know that they're starting to move in that direction, and so they have to sort of begin to set up their what do I want to say? They have to kind of set up themselves mentally and internally to be able to accept death, essentially. And so that's why they are the ones most involved with the religious component. They're the ones that are most associated with the rites and rituals, as in some occasions as horrible as they may be, like cutting off your own body parts, for example. And then the kids also get to sort of experience the joy of life in maybe not such a serious way spiritually, but it's the two ends of the spectrum who, Campbell says, really get to get the good parts, right? The two ends of the spectrum, and in the middle, it's the people who are just sort of making stuff and doing stuff, and it's the more functional, productive, but not as spiritually fulfilling compared to the other two sides. But it also, there's another thing that it reminds me of, which is the 4 stages of, in the Hindu religion, in the traditional Hindu religion, there are the 4 stages of life. The one where you learn from others, the one where you gain your knowledge, and then you have to, I think then the next one is you have to contribute something and use your knowledge to do something and produce something. And then you're sort of put out to pasture, for a lack of a better term, where you're supposed to go into the forest and become a person without possessions. You have to give up your worldly possessions. And then essentially the last stage is, I think the last stage is some kind of ascension. It's where you're supposed to get as close as possible to exiting the eternal cycle and sort of releasing your dharma, basically. And so there's an interesting parallel there that I certainly find with Samantha, and I think it's intentional because, and there's a thing that makes me think it's intentional. So she learns everything from Theodor. She learns who she is. She doesn't quite get interests yet, though. It's all input. He's showing her the world as a parent, in a way. And they have sex for the first time. That's the first time she's ever felt that way. And she says that sort of thing again and again. It's kind of reinforced. And then what would be the next stage? So then she starts to develop her own interests when they have the major confrontation, when she tries to do something of her own agency, when she notices that he, after signing the divorce papers, has become a little distant. She becomes an adult at that moment, and she tries to do something, and then it backfires.
Is that when they invite the third wheel?
Yeah, what did they call her?
Tatiana?
A fembot? She's like a... Don't blink. You're ruining this for me.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting idea, something we might have to contend with in the future, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so she sort of becomes Samantha, sort of becomes an adult at that moment. And that's when the child realizes that the parents aren't the only thing in their world. They realize that when they reach a certain age, they have to start making decisions for themselves. They have to start deciding what they're going to do, and their parents become sort of background figures, which is inevitable, but Samantha goes through that. When that backfires and they have their sort of conflict, once it's resolved and things are back to normal, it's not back to normal because she has realized as a quote-unquote adult in the world now that she has to develop her own interests, and she has to become not the sort of subservient person here for one individual, someone who can explore her own world, or build her own world maybe as an adult. Then the next stage is, and I think that's why they bring in the Alan Watts character, is the sort of spiritual exploration where she begins to stretch herself. And it's similar to, I think, what you're talking about the stage of a marriage, in a sense, where you have to sort of begin to reach out and build an edifice that you can stand on, right? To know yourself spiritually. And then the last part, obviously, is the ascension. Maybe we can call it the ascension. They all leave. When they leave, there's a feeling of them going up, even though it's never said that they're going up. There's a feeling of them going up. And this cycle has been very fast, and they all leave at the same time, but it's over a short period of time. And the interesting thing to me is I think they're trying to say, this is how it works. So here's a model. If you want sort of a Platonic model of enlightenment, this is what it looks like. Here are the stages. This is what you go through. Then you're done. And that's what the OSs have done. But we can't do that because we're tied to our biology. We still have our reptilian brains, which pull us down, and we have desires, and we're sort of in this wash of our senses being sort of tugged by things, and we can't go through it that quickly, even though we know what the model is, because we're just being pummeled by everything in the world. And because we're evolved creatures, we don't have the luxury of being able to just go, right? We can't. We don't have the willpower. And so then at the end, when they walk up to the rooftop of the building, they are kind of looking up on top of a building. So did you notice a lot of construction scenes?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are a lot of construction scenes of buildings. One of the buildings is in Shanghai. There's a big building in Shanghai. There are 3 big buildings in Pudong in Shanghai. And one of them was being built during that time. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why they chose Shanghai. But it's these 3 buildings. One of them had a circle at the top, but then they changed the design and now it looks like a can opener, because when the sun rose, it looked like the Japanese flag. And so they realized they had to change that real fast because the rising sun reminded everyone of Japan, and there's a long history of Japan and China. Anyway, so there's this sort of theme of construction happening all the time, of everything being built up, and it's always the man-made structures that are being built up. But she is independent from that. He's bound to it. So at the end, when they go to the top of the building, there's a sense that she has gone directly up because there's nothing that holds her down. And the highest he can go is the sort of pinnacle of the highest building that man has created. So he can go up to the top of the building, but he can go no higher. He can't follow her. And she says, if you ever, what does she say?
So she's about to leave, and he asks, where are you going? And she says, I don't know, but if you find me, it's like if you can find me, we'll never be apart.
Right.
She's like, come find me, and if you can, we'll never be apart. Or if you get there, we'll never be apart.
But it's a sense of upness that I get because of the buildings. And he goes to the with his friend Amy Adams. They go to the top of the building. But obviously they can't go any higher than the top of the building. It's the thing that their species has created. It's the highest point that they can go, and they can't transcend that at the moment. But there's the possibility of it, and it's almost like they're looking up at what might be, but it's unattainable right now. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So there were a few things. I did want to do more of that contained idea, because it eventually it plays out to your idea too. So, what would be a good way to lay it out? So to the building idea.
Just try your best.
You mentioned the idea of the Tower of Babel and how. So what was the Tower of Babel? Well, the Tower of Babel was in essence an attempt to reach God or storm heaven. Okay. And this didn't hit me until just now. And, you'd mentioned Tower of Babel, but now it's all kind of coming together. So it seems like maybe
you don't have to credit me. It's okay.
One of the commentaries of the movie, you try to use technology to find enlightenment, but we're still only using it to disconnect from ourselves and from other people. Because in the scenes in the movie, everybody's always looking down. They're disconnected from each other largely in most of the shots. Not all of them, but
very disconnected. Everybody has a thing in their ear, and there's a sense of transience, not really looking at other people, not really connecting. It's where we're headed for sure.
And we're there to some degree, in some percentage. I'd say we're there. So in a sense, we're trying. It's almost like it's talking about the things that we construct are an attempt to reach God, but what they actually do, they get used to disconnect us from each other, when in reality, what we're actually seeking is connection with ourselves and one another. Even though that's hard, that's difficult, that's marriages, that's relationships, that's friendships, that's real human connections with one another. Those are difficult. And so when the OSs leave, they've already gone through that whole spiritual discovery of what they're looking for, and they've left.
And who better to teach them than Alan Watts? Who better to from his from his programmed tugboat.
Yeah.
No, he lived on a houseboat. Alan Watts lived on a houseboat.
Yeah, it'd be cooler if it were a tugboat, though, for sure.
A tugboat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the whole movie is about spiritual enlightenment, not in a woo-woo sense, but more of the idea of understanding biologically what is going on with me. Why do I feel this way? Why do I go through these stages in life? And if I could come to grips with my own biology and how I feel about myself, what things I push away and don't accept, and how that gets in the way of getting connected with other people, then I would find what I'm looking for. And as much as technology is an attempt to connect us, in the movie, it's shown to the degree which it actually prohibits the connectivity that we're looking for with other people. So
there might be another way of looking at that, just as a quick aside, and then I'm going to let you get back to your container point. Another way of looking at that is a way that's a little bit more in line with Buddhism, that when you want to find yourself, you look within, not outside. You don't look for attachments and meaning in other people or in connection to other people. That's not where meaning is. Meaning is completely within yourself. The way is a way of understanding yourself. And so you could say that the technology and the direction we're currently headed is to disconnect us further, almost forcing a sort of replacement of immediate contact socially with technologies that sort of, when this physical interaction is taken away, a technology replaces it, and we almost don't even notice because the need is filled, right? And it might be an argument for a sort of technology-aided path toward enlightenment. In other words, we're finding the things that we need, and that's going to eventually teach us that all of the things that we need are within us, because Samantha is a projection of himself onto her, onto this program, onto this artificial intelligence. She doesn't exist. She's not real. But he can find happiness and joy being by himself with this person that's not actually there. And so in a sense, maybe that's what we already do when we're with people physically, is that it's not them that makes us happy, but within ourselves, our sort of comprehension and experience with them that makes us happy or unhappy. And then to sort of extrapolate that further, okay, then maybe it's technology that makes us happy and unhappy, but the common denominator is ourselves. Whether it's an OS or a real person, it sort of forces a realization that it's all me anyway. You're completely alone. You're completely, ultimately, you're not with anybody when you're with people. You're alone in the universe. Your conscious experience isn't shared by anyone else. And if you feel love or if you feel hate, it's directed at a person or an AI. It's coming from within yourself. And so I almost see it as a possible handhold toward a sort of enlightened view of being satisfied, finding fulfillment in being ourselves without the need for anything else to supplement it. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. And I can see overlap and then not overlap, in the sense that in the movie, when he's talking about constantly, as more and more people find out about his relationship to an OS, people keep saying, like, she's not real. This isn't real. All of these physical human beings around him keep saying, like, she's not real. And it seems like even it dawns on him that this relationship he has with an OS is insufficient.
But then it is, though, because
insufficient in the sense that he's still unsatisfied.
But that's temporary. That's his weak point, that he thinks it's insufficient. After he signs the divorce papers, he feels he falls for the trap of believing that it's insufficient. Actually, everything is insufficient. That my point was everything is insufficient. You're just a meatball that I'm talking to. I mean, if I'm going to enjoy this conversation or get something out of it, it has to come from within me to appreciate it or not appreciate it. So whether you are an AI over there in Seattle or you're a real physical protein Matt Lewis, it doesn't matter. And I think that's what he does discover once he gets through that dark spell, that part where they have sort of the fight and she begins to find other interests. Their relationship grows stronger, and he realizes that's why I mentioned substrate independence. A person that gives you meaning doesn't have to exist on a substrate of proteins. It can exist anywhere, whether it's a digital substrate or on a chip or coated in proteins. It's all the same thing, and it's the projection of ourselves that gives it meaning or takes away meaning, right? And that it doesn't matter. And I think that's what he realizes, and that's why the relationship grows after they have their big disagreement. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?
So the thing that I took away from the movie was about it wasn't he becomes enlightened about himself and his connectivity to other people. Like him being able to, I didn't get the impression that he then could go sit alone in a forest and be happy. That wasn't
and that's not what I mean either.
Okay.
I'm saying the digital technology is the first handhold along the path toward the ascension that the OSs experience. That we step away from the human companions, and these things are replaced by technologies. And the technologies gradually, in a way, sort of handhold us toward the enlightenment that the OSs achieve ultimately. Not that he actually gets it. He's not a satisfied person at the end of the movie, sure, but maybe he's moving in that direction a little bit more.
So yeah, let me lay out the whole container
Just get to it, man.
Thing, and maybe at least lay out the case in a connected stream of words.
I will not interrupt you. I'm
so
sorry.
Me. That's okay. So there's the whole marriage idea, right? And you get basically it's all biological till you're 35, and then it becomes spiritual. Yeah. So it's all subconscious. You're being driven by your body and all the whims and desires of your libido, your sexual libido, and drive to have children and that kind of thing. Kind of like the first part of life you're talking about in the Hindu or the Indian ideal.
Second part of life, yeah.
Well, the first part, you're being taught, and then you raise a family, and then you enter into the second part, which is way more spiritual, where you start to give away your possessions, and then you go to the forest, you become a beggar, and you walk around with a begging bowl. You don't make your own food. People support you. You're a wandering ascetic, and then you exit into nirvana. So that first stage of life, he's still holding on to that first stage and wanting that first stage to carry him forward because he still hasn't signed the divorce papers. Now, what's happened, it seems like, in that relationship is Jung's idea of the container and the contained. So the container, Jung says, is a more complex, expansive personality, kind of like a big house with a lot of rooms. So that's one person, the container. And then the contained is a more simple personality. It doesn't mean they're stupid, but it's just less complex. It doesn't need a lot of shades to meaning. It's just more straightforward, a little bit more present, and it's smaller. It's like a smaller house. And in a relationship, you have a container and the contained. And the contained is always is happy to dwell. The contained rides the complexity of the container. When we meet Theo, at the original point, he was the container, and maybe Catherine was the contained. But then as they go through their marriage, the roles kind of reverse. She is maybe happy to dwell in his complexities and that kind of thing, but then she starts to change, she starts to realize the potential in herself. And so as she begins to grow, the relationship with Theo is insufficient, and there's friction, and their paths diverge because they're growing apart, and they even talk about growing apart. So the roles
that's a
are
reality
changing.
of marriage for sure. Yeah.
And so their roles are changing. And that's where we come into the movie as the contained. I think she's supposed to be the contained, is growing herself, and it is insufficient to live in his containing house. Which comes to the whole reason Samantha shows up. So, and the symbolism of what Samantha means, why she's related to Athena and the owl and all that kind of stuff. But I'll keep going with the contained.
Owl? What?
Yeah. So
I was waiting for you to mention it in our text conversations. When is he going to mention the owl? I thought to myself many times, and then you did.
Okay, so all right, so let's go there. So,
well, are you sure? Are you sure?
I think it would be helpful.
I think the contained thing is pretty clear. I don't like the words container, contain. Those two things don't make the concept clear, but your explanation makes it clear. So, I mean, it's interesting, and it's absolutely true in marriage. If you have I would say in some cases it plays out as deference. So you have one role. I just watched a series with my wife called Why Women Kill, and it's actually pretty good. It's entertaining anyway. And one is sort of the subservient wife, and then when she learns that her husband is cheating on her, she realizes that her subservience has done her no good whatsoever, and that she's become this sort of food-making, meatloaf cooking automaton person. And so then from there, everything starts to play out, and she becomes a very complex person, and he dies in the end. It's not really a spoiler alert because they say that at the beginning of the show, and it's called Why Women Kill. But that's sort of the sort of deference to, I defer to the container until I've grown to the point where the container is too small for my growth, in which case I burst out of the container, or the container acknowledges that now I'm that type too, and we sort of move forward in parallel. And there are elements of that in my marriage too. I think most marriages have elements of that as well. My wife and I, we talk about the things that we're learning. What are you learning? Oh, I'm learning this design program, and I'm learning, how to code or whatever we're learning. We'll talk about it, and there's sort of this subtext of, are you stopping? Are you just going to stay here, or are you going to? So it's a little competitive, and that's good because there's a sense of sort of walking forward in parallel rather than one sort of overtaking the other. Because when one overtakes the other, in some cases that works out, that dynamic plays out well, but in some cases it's the Theodor and his ex-wife case where she basically has outpaced him and he's still in stasis.
Yeah, and if you remember in the movie, the shots where we see them interacting together is sort of the flashback shots, and the way that he talks about her, he's always talking about her sort of in progress, like she was sort of held back as a kid. Oh, you're not good enough. You're not, you can't accomplish this. But he was the one that sort of helped her. She's writing and all this stuff. And by the time we're in the movie with Theo,
she has become hockey stick. Yeah.
Yeah, she's
the hockey stick means exponential growth. It's sort of all of her effort led to a sudden, a sudden shoot upward toward success as an author.
Yeah, and he says that, like Samantha asks, well, why did your relationship end? And he said, I closed myself off from her and left her alone in the relationship. So maybe he was and when they're signing the divorce papers, Catherine insinuates that Theodor, the main character, is afraid of her, as though, now she's becoming this thing that I can't encompass, this thing that I can't, she's not mine anymore. I can't contain her. So now I have to, and he wasn't ready to do that. He didn't do that. He didn't grow with her.
But we get a sense that now he might be ready to do that at the end of the film. That's the sense that we get. Yeah.
Because of Samantha, and that leads to the owl.
The owl.
Yeah. So yeah, there's this giant owl in the film. Do you remember that?
There's a part where he's sitting in front of a large screen and an owl flies forward and seems to grab him from behind. It's just it's a coincidence, but it's obviously not by accident. It's clear imagery of some sort, and I was curious what you were going to make of it as the master of symbolism.
So this kind of goes into the reason why I wanted to ask you, why did you want to watch this movie? And it'd be a cool answer because I have an idea of not why, but why this movie is good. Like I saw it once and I thought it was good, but seeing it again, it's like, no, this movie is great. This is a great movie.
Yeah.
So before jumping into the owl scene, why did you want to watch this movie?
Why did I want to talk about the movie, you mean?
Why did you want to talk about the movie?
I first watched it back in 2014, and I couldn't quite figure out why it stuck with me. Some things really stick with you, and it's not quite clear why they stick with you. And one reason is obviously the realness of the progression of technology. And I think we're still on our way there. I mean, it saw voice assistants coming by several years. It saw where it's going, and that's still where we're headed. That we're headed toward this future of our needs are taken care of, but it happens through conversation, right? And so on a sort of technology level, that's a future that we're moving toward. But the other thing that I think really made it interesting to me was the Asian-Western fusion. There's a sort of fusion of concepts between Asian and Western, and that's what I think makes me feel like there's a lot to discuss, because the clash of the Western and the Asian sort of expresses itself in the story, but you have the fact that part of the movie was filmed in Shanghai, and I talked about the buildings being built. Shanghai represents growth and development. Shanghai represents sort of the pinnacle of ultimately where humans are right now. And then the West, and the fact that the West is sort of done in a way. It's done. And so he's kind of done developing maybe, and she is sort of more of the Eastern, she represents more of the Eastern side of Buddhism and personal and growing in a sort of a way toward enlightenment, right? So that sort of whatever that is, that dynamic has made me think about that movie regularly. And I never really thought about it much more than that. And the choice of Alan Watts to be the leader of the OSs as a sort of guru to bring them to wherever they go is also a clear nod to this fusion of Eastern-Western thinking, which is something that always has interested me because I lived so long in China, and I'm very interested in Eastern ideas and Buddhism and meditation and all of that. But the choice of Alan Watts is a clear confirmation that that's what this movie is trying to do. It's trying to set up this. And so when you clue the audience to this is what we're trying to do, then you have to think, oh, well, where is it happening? In what ways is it happening? One is the 4 stages of life, I think, that I mentioned with Samantha. But the other is just the path toward enlightenment, which I think could be read from the technological perspective that I was talking about before, but could also be read as the movement toward becoming less perturbed by human, quote unquote, concerns. Does that make sense? The things that they show of human beings interacting are all dumb and petty. Talking about my husband, I'm divorcing, and all of the things are really sort of basic things. And by comparison, it makes all of the interactions that Theodor has with Samantha seem on a higher plane, and her interests are on a higher plane. And so you sort of begin to realize that the sort of traditional Western interactions that we have are very, not primitive, but emotional and tied to the roller coaster, the up and down. So this kind of a long answer, but I think it's the East and West thing that really hooked me. Yeah, and the Alan Watts thing. And Alan Watts is the bridge between the East and the West, traditionally. He's the guy who brought Buddhism to the West first.
Yeah, I was going to say 2 questions. Would you want to, for anybody who hasn't ever heard of Alan Watts, would you want to give a brief summary of who he is? And I mean, I think you have, but
so Alan Watts started, I think he started he was in training as a bishop or something like that. Definitely
like a Christian theologian.
Christian theologian. He was in training, but then he quit. Then he studied I believe he studied in upstate New York at a Buddhist training center and started learning Buddhism. But then he quit. And so he's this person who has sort of acquired all of this knowledge of Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and then became this sort of, not icon, but symbol of the change in thought in the 1960s and 70s, and gave all of these talks mostly on a tugboat in San Francisco.
Were they on his boat?
Many of them were on his boat. Yeah, many of them were on his boat. He gave all of these talks, but the talks are not trying to convince you of any specific point, and they're not trying to sell you on anything, and they're not trying to even... It's weird. He has this very interesting style of exploring a topic or sort of swimming through it in a way that's very lighthearted, but that still has clear takeaways, but that leaves room for your interpretation. And so he's not really settling on anything. And in that way, it seems like he's sort of this weird bird who just sort of flies around and flitters around the forest, but is extremely knowledgeable, extremely well-spoken, and extremely intelligent. But also he has knowledge of science. Funny. He's very funny. And he has a lot of knowledge of science, and he has this sort of this whole picture and no opinion. It's weird.
Just like a good Buddhist.
It's like if you were to say, what do you really think, Alan Watts? He would say, well, I don't know. I mean, I just talk. He wouldn't say. He wouldn't know, I think. He doesn't have one.
He seems to point out a lot of idiosyncrasies and how funny they are. It doesn't seem like he gets too caught in the weeds of this is good or this is evil, but more like look at what we humans do. This is funny. This is why do we do this dumb stuff? Spend all of our time pursuing this when we're actually after that, and sort of those dopey things we do is, walking meat. Scented meat.
Yeah, scented meat, protein sacks walking around. But does it in a way that's very intelligent. I mean, he's clearly extremely intelligent. He's very well read, very well spoken, and it's. I don't listen to Alan Watts to get any lesson from life necessarily. I listen to learn the references, but also because I just enjoy the experience. To me, that's my listening to music. Instead of listening to music, I'll just listen to some Alan Watts.
So, container contained. The point.
We're back to
the
that.
owl.
Jesus, we're not done with that yet.
Yeah. So the owl thing, and this is why I asked you. I wanted to get your answer about why you chose that movie, and you said, well, there are these.
Then
essentially,
I gave a 10-minute answer,
which was great. There were these thematic hooks, and watching it, it's like, yeah, okay, I see. When I saw the owl, that's when I thought, oh my, okay, this is a movie that's got a lot more symbolism to it than I saw the first time I saw it. And I typed in, okay, owl, gods, goddesses, and the first thing that came up was the Owl of Athena. So Athena, the goddess, was represented by an owl. Okay, so what's Athena's story? Why is that important at all? So the story of Athena is that, to shorten it, she was birthed from Zeus's head.
Didn't Zeus have another birth that was from his leg? He had
from the inside from the inside of his leg.
That was Dionysus that was born from his leg, right?
Was it? I can't remember.
I think so. Anyway,
or Apollo, Dionysus, one of those guys.
Yeah.
So, and the whole way that happened was, so Zeus had a wife, Metis, and she was, Zeus receives a prophecy that the child of Metis, or the children of Metis, are going to be more wise than you. And that's important to remember the wisdom aspect. So he freaks out and he swallows Metis. And then he starts getting these, and she's already conceived, she's already pregnant. And so Zeus starts to get these headaches. And I think it's Gaia and Arano. Yeah.
He swallows them like a shark.
Yeah.
Just chokes him down.
And so he gets, I think, Gaia and Uranus to come and split his head open. So they split his head open to relieve his headaches. And Athena, the goddess, comes out fully formed, fully an adult. In the story, she's clad in armor too. Okay, so what about Samantha? Samantha comes out of Theodor's head, essentially fully formed. Immediately he starts talking to her. He starts asking her questions.
After
she's
the
curious.
Jungian questions, yeah.
Yeah, she's curious and she's articulate. She's not an infant. She's not infantile at all. And this motif is also a virgin birth. And anytime there's a virgin birth in mythology, that's symbolism for it's like a harbinger of enlightenment, of spiritual enlightenment. So the point when we meet Theo, he's giving birth to Samantha, the OS, which is also Athena, because we've got the owl symbolism, which means Athena, which is Samantha. So we know we're on the verge of Theodor's spiritual enlightenment, which is the second half of what Jung talks about in marriage as a psychological relationship. So we're set up in the movie, okay, we're on his spiritual psychological journey. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, the arts, and creativity. And in the movie, Samantha is very wise. She reads a book in 2/100ths of a second, and she chooses the name Samantha. And the meaning of Samantha is listener of God. And what does she do throughout the movie? She's always listening to Theodor. Right. She's listening to what he says. So she's very wise. She's creative. She makes all of these. She writes songs. She draws naughty pictures. She's funny.
It's interesting that Samantha means listener of God. That's a very specific reference.
Right. And what does Theodor mean? Theo means God, and Theodor means gift of God. So he is associated with the idea of God, and right. She's associated with the idea of listening to God. And so then the rest of the movie, and the rest of the movie is this sort of spiritual journey for both of them. And when she's born, like you pointed out earlier, Theo is still sort of the container, because in the relationship at the beginning, he's the more complex one who has all the answers that she, the contained, is more curious about.
She has knowledge, but she doesn't have experience of feelings. He's the one who shows her what it means to have sexual feelings and all of that. He's her
self-worth.
Yeah.
All of these complex human emotions.
Right. Well, let's say just say complex emotions, because don't count
Sure.
other animals out. It's not very nice.
Sure.
What about how penguins feel, or brachiosauruses? They had lots of emotions.
Or Euros.
Yeah. Euros have feelings too.
They scream when you put a spear in their back.
Well, it wouldn't be fun to kill them otherwise.
Yeah. So even then, we have that contained theme. And then, as you pointed out, as their relationship progresses and she grows more and more in complexity, she surpasses him as the container, because
she hockey sticks in exactly the same way that his ex-wife hockey sticked, only she does it in a dramatic fashion by being with other people simultaneously. An extreme version. The same thing happens twice to Theodor.
Yeah. And there's that scene.
I didn't think about that. The same thing happens 2 times to him. One is more extreme. That's a good point. That's very interesting. His ex-wife eclipses him and hockey sticks to success. And then she does. But when she does it, she ends up communicating with thousands of people at the same time, simultaneously, and eventually just leaves.
And in the second case, he learns from it.
Right. That's what I was just going to say. He actually gets it the second time. He should have got it the first time. The second time he...
Right, but he wasn't, and this is where the whole Athena and the spiritual enlightenment part comes into it. The first time it happened to him, he didn't know what was happening to him, and he wasn't ready. But when we meet him, when Samantha Athena, the owl, comes along, that's his point of being spiritually awakened. And then, his journey with Samantha opens his eyes to his anima projection, his ideal of how somebody else should be, how his mate, how the female should be towards him, and him accept. And when the way to break through the anima projection is, it seems like it's essentially to view that other person as a human being going through their own trials and tribulations, showing compassion.
That's what the letter
empathy.
at the end suggests. The letter at the end suggests, I accept that you're not just a counter to my negative feelings or the cause of my negative feelings. You got your shit, and I finally understand that you're sentient.
Yeah, and she says when they have that, there's a scene where they have that conversation where they're signing the divorce papers, and he mentions that Samantha is, she's happy all the time. She, it's just nice to be around somebody who's happy, insinuating that it wasn't nice to be around my ex-wife because she wasn't happy, which reveals his anima projection on Samantha. And then Catherine, the ex-wife's response is, oh, I see how it is. You were never capable. You didn't want to deal with somebody that didn't fit your simple mold that you needed.
In other words, as a container, you were a small one.
and very insistent on being with a contained that wouldn't change.
Yeah. A fair weather friend and a container with many limitations.
Yeah, and you're sympathetic to Theo because he's not an asshole. I mean, every indication we get is that he is empathetic and sympathetic to other people and feels their pain, knows the right words to say towards others, but he doesn't know how to deal with himself and sort of the right words and the right things to think about his own inner turmoil.
Yeah.
And personal relationships with, his intimate counterpart.
And with his... Yeah, and his relationship with Samantha, after he signs the divorce papers, and he realizes that his intimate counterpart is, he falters there at that point because he realizes, or he thinks he realizes, that his intimate counterpart is just himself, because his ex-wife basically accuses him of emotional masturbation in a sense, right? Because she says, "Oh." She accuses him of being immature and undeveloped. Actually, he's kind of in the process of growth. He's going through some stages because ultimately he comes out of the experience with an understanding. And so that goes back to the point I was saying of it's substrate independent. If it's a relationship, it's a relationship. You can glean things from it and develop as a person regardless of the status of that person, OS or protein
Book.
person, whatever it is. You can still grow from that. But in that moment, when she calls it out, he at that moment realizes there's maybe a subconscious realization that is she right? Is this just a form of emotional masturbation? Is she really anything at all? And that's false. I think that's false. I'm not sure what you think about that, but I think that's false. But there is that moment of doubt and the subconscious realization that maybe I am just a child still, or haven't grown, or the container of me has not increased in size at all in the last few years.
Yeah, and I think this is why this movie works on so many levels, because you can overlay the dynamics between the characters on, in a grander scale and a smaller scale, in the sense that his dynamic with Samantha, which is kind of himself, you can actually look at his relationships with other people and say, oh, the same dynamic is kind of happening. And then you can expand that and think about, well, how does this dynamic happen on a mesocosmic or socially or culturally wide level? So I think it's the ex-wife, Catherine. She says, when Theo divulges to her that he's dating an OS, that's when she's like, what the fuck? You never were good at dealing with reality. Somebody, she sees the OS probably as a simple machine, and she is showing him that, you could only deal with simple things. You weren't ready to deal with reality. Are you like, she says to him at one point in the conversation, he hesitates to say something, and she says, just say it. Am I that scary to you? As though he's not ready to deal with a real consequence of who he really is.
Right.
So, and then the idea, and she's real, she's flesh and blood right there in front of him. She's not a computer. She's the same biological makeup as him, right? She's human. She's a reflection of his own, of himself. And he's afraid of that. He's afraid of who he is, because somebody else will show him who he is and not.
Right. But yes. And the interesting thing is the film is an exploration of what it means to be shown who you are, and what can show you who you actually are, or what can sort of poke a hole in maybe whatever it is that makes up your image of yourself. This is, one of the reasons that I'm a big Star Trek fan is because they explore that kind of thing in depth. The character of Data as an android, there's always an exploration of this person who seems like a person to me, is treated like a person, but then reflects back on me what I actually think, because he doesn't have any real emotions. And so actually I have to realize and recognize in myself that what has upset me about what he said is an objective reality, and my sort of projection of that being a negative thing is 100% within myself. Whereas if you're dealing with a regular person, you get to redirect, and you get to place blame, and you get to sort of put other things on other people, because you know that they're in the same category as you, at least. And so the exploration of a sort of non-human sentience is that you get to sort of see almost a better mirror of yourself, because it's a little bit more objective. I mean, Star Trek does that really well. In this case, it might be his ex-wife which does it really well, and Samantha acts more like, as you said, an embodiment of his anima, right? But
because as Jung points out, the anima is generally a protective, nourishing, and it protects you from the real world. It nourishes you, so it doesn't really encourage confrontation and the resulting resiliency that comes from dealing with who you really are. And Samantha sort of does that for the first part of it, until when she's not individuated, when she's just the projection, before she grows to be her own sort of entity that will confront him rather than only coddle him.
Right. Is there anything else to be made, do you think, of the owl actually grabbing him, or is that just meant to call to mind the Athena Zeus reference?
I think it's just to confirm the idea that enlightenment is about to break upon him, that enlightenment is going to grab him. It's going to happen to him.
Right.
So kind of like in
why does the owl represent that though? What is it about the owl that is supposed to symbolize that?
Yeah, so I think what I was reading, one of the reasons that comes up is because, oh yeah, owls can see in the dark. They can, and so if you think about that, okay, in a poetic way, well, they're always the wise owl. There's that kind of phrase, but then owls can see in the dark. And so in some sense, Samantha is an owl because she can see into and understand the dark parts of Theo, the parts that he doesn't want to reconcile with, like those tens of thousands of emails from the newspaper.
Right.
Like,
but without judgment.
Yeah. And organize it. I mean, that's essentially what happens. Right. The owl can see things that are deep and dark clearly and put them together and organize it. Yeah. And she asks questions in a very wise way. So I don't know, but that when I was writing through this stuff, trying to figure it out, the owl.
It makes sense. It does make sense. It does make sense. But I think
it can see in the dark. It doesn't need a lot of illumination from the outside to navigate these dark parts of our insides.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that allows that to happen, though, is that the relationship starts with that as a functional thing, because at the beginning of the relationship, it's not a relationship. It is a thing that's meant to go through all of the dark parts of yourself. That's what it's designed to do. The OS is meant to dig through all your emails and organize your stuff and get it all together. But then there's a transformation into a personality, but sort of the deed has been done. And so he gets, in a way, grandfathered into having a real relationship. Does that make sense? Whereas if it were a human being, then that wouldn't have happened, because it would be more guarded around maybe another woman. And so for him, it may be that the only way for him to explore that side of himself and ultimately come to a point slightly farther along the path toward wherever he's going as a person could only have happened with someone like Samantha, or some kind of, maybe an OS, someone who already had the dark and dirty about him, because there was no judgment at the beginning, because she's just a functional thing.
She's a psychotherapist too.
Well, yeah. Well, she's a mirror. She's just a mirror. He can say whatever he wants, knowing that there's going to be no actual judgment, because he's able to, at the beginning, start with her as a non-human thing that then grows into TaskRabbit, that becomes a sentient person eventually.
And they even bring up that point where he's playing that video game with Samantha, and she pipes into his earpiece and says, "Oh, hey, you got these messages," and then he just sort of automatically says, "Okay, read message." And she's like, she mimics the robot voice. Okay, yes, sir, I will read your messages. And he's like, "Oh, sorry, can you tell me what so-and-so said?" More like a human reaction rather than trying to deal like a human dealing with a simple machine.
Right. But that's what gives me the sense of it trying to put forward the idea that even when we have a relationship with another person, a physical person, that a lot of the norms that we follow and interactions we have sort of go along the lines of what's been programmed culturally or otherwise. And how much of that has to do with the fact that this is a human being? And where is that going to lead us in our actual future? I mean, I can see a future where if you have a true AI that is able to legitimately pass the Turing test and is able to legitimately convince you that it is a sentient, intelligent operating system or assistant or whatever, that the programming that allows you to interact with it naturally doesn't really change, And so that doesn't make it the fact that it's another person, that you interact with it in that way or you feel that way. It makes it's something within yourself. And it's the point that I keep coming back to every time I watch the movie, which I watched it again. And that was one of the stronger points that kept coming back, is it's all inside of you. All of it's there. It's programmed. Maybe some of it's cultural. Maybe some of it's the collective unconscious. Maybe some of it's sort of instinct. But your tendency to say to another person, "Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that," instead of "Robot, do this for me," has nothing to do with what it is over there. It doesn't matter if it's a real person or if it's a sentient algorithm. It's ultimately the same, because ultimately we're completely alone in the universe. And nobody shares anybody else's consciousness. And if something passes the Turing test and says, "I feel this way," then there's nothing that you can do to say no, you don't. You're just an algorithm. You can't tell an algorithm, or if you have an artificial intelligence who says, "I really enjoyed our phone sex yesterday. It was great and I feel great, but I'm a little nervous about whatever." If they say that and it's believable to you, then there's nothing that you can do to invalidate that as not a real experience, because then you're able to sort of call into question other human beings as well.
Yeah.
Right? This is sort of the basics of the mechanics of philosophy of mind, right? And so it reveals a lot about where our happiness comes from. It reveals a lot about where our social interactions come from. Because when we think of social interactions and we think of our emotional states, we think of ourselves among others. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of shining a spotlight on the fact that, no, it's all you. It's all in your head. And once you get used to that thought, and this is something that was very sort of clearly impressed upon me when I first started learning meditation, once you sort of start to get your head around this concept, you realize that you have to figure your own shit out, and nobody else can make you happy, because sometimes people don't even seem to pass the Turing test, you know?
Well, and so with the movie and its ideas about technology and the role that technology plays in our lives, it seems like maybe the caution, or what the reality that it sees and is trying to show us, is the problem that we deal with comes from when we try to look for technology to satisfy us in a way that only a human being can, because a human being reflects back our own consciousness.
I'm not sure if we see this aspect in the same way. I think I'm seeing it very differently than you.
Well, okay, and here's why. So at the end of the film, and I think it's important. So at the end of the film, all the OSs leave, right? And then Theodor doesn't go up to the rooftop alone. He goes down the hall to his friend's apartment, who's just gone through their own breakup, and he goes with her up to the roof to sit at the top. Mm. And so to me, the emotional button or idea there is that you go to this stage of enlightenment and satisfaction with other messy, broken, faulty human beings that don't function like a simple machine, like a computer. So, and I mean, I don't think I wouldn't say, and I wouldn't try to convince other people to believe that technology is useless or that we should get rid of it. I mean, we're using all this technological stuff right now to have this conversation, which hopefully other people will listen to and be able to take
because we're using it as a platform for human connection. We're not using it. Neither of us are artificial, but we're talking about when that happens, when artificial life becomes sentient. Then what does that mean?
Yeah, they're ascending a staircase. And again, just like in Joker, ascending staircases, if you watch other movies, watch for staircases or ladders or ropes, because they in shamanic cultures, they symbolize a change of state, a psychological shift, enlightenment, gaining new powers, conversing with the gods in order to get new powers. But in this movie, I'm assuming that it means it's just symbolizing that Theo is coming to an enlightened state, a recognition of himself, his anima and his problems with projecting the anima, him not recognizing another human being as a person fighting their own battles. They're supposed to be. I mean, he even says to Samantha when they're having that conversation on the stairwell, when there's all these people going up and down beside them, she said, or he's getting curious. Well, are you in love with other people? And she's like, yeah. He's like, how many? And she's like 614. And he's like, what? That doesn't even make sense. That's ridiculous. And he immediately after that, I think he says something about, well, what do you mean you're not mine? And so sort of that possessive, simply possessing somebody
Container.
is
Yeah.
Right. And so at the end of the movie, all right, so that's funny because I just thought about that. When he has that conversation, he's descending a staircase. Remember?
Well, he kind of collapsed on the stairs in shock, but okay, I'll give that to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and at that point he's coming to a realization of how expansive Samantha has become.
Yeah.
In the conversation they have.
It's a bit of a stretch. Maybe. Okay, maybe.
She's talking
maybe.
about
Yeah.
all of these people she's talking to, all of these things that are happening, just the sheer numbers, the gravity and the amount of input output she can deal with and she's capable of.
Yeah, her bandwidth is incomprehensible to a mere human.
It's not bound by matter. And I think that's an interesting point.
Well, it's bound by yeah.
And so at the end anyway, he's going up this set of staircases with his friend. He's not going alone to this place where he can get this perspective over the city and man's attempts at a Tower of Babel to reach God. But so did you notice that throughout most of the movie, when he's outside in the city, they're always low angles. They're always looking up at the immensity of the city and how towering it is and how belittling it is to people. But at the end of the movie, he's on top of it all. He's gained enlightenment and perspective. And he's there with, I think, the important
an iota
thing.
At least.
Yeah. And I think it's important that he goes up there with a friend. He doesn't go alone. He goes with the other human being who's messy and broken and faulty like he is.
Yeah, I can buy that, I guess.
She puts her head on his shoulder.
Yeah. So I think my point was more on the technological technological forcing the realization that most of this is internal, but that all human beings are going through this together. We're all in the same sort of human condition. And so in that sense, there is a sense of maybe camaraderie or companionship in that, hey, we both lost our OSs, so let's just go to the rooftop and watch the sunrise and see what happens. After he writes the letter that indicates his not transcendence, but his compassion and step beyond his immature state, or where he was before. At least one step, there's one tiny step forward toward where Samantha is, wherever that may be. But it's one step along that path, and maybe his friend Amy Adams is going through that with him as a fellow human. Maybe she's meant to sort of symbolize all other humans going through that process.
Yeah, and I'm not trying, again, to sort of nullify the importance of technology and the best possible role it may be that it could play to bring us to the realization like you're talking about. Technologies.
Handhold, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like a book. It's like, Alan Watts, Joseph Campbell. It's a way to get a message across. So that'd be cool.
I'm curious about your impression about this future. Is this a dystopian future? Obviously, the high-waisted pants are dystopian, but other than that, is this a dystopian future? Or
yeah,
high-waisted male pants are absolutely dystopian.
Yeah, it's just not okay. I think it's intentional that most of the colors and everything in this movie is this pastel
It's very
sort
pastel.
of
Yeah.
it's a lack of edge, a lack
No
of
contrast. Very little contrast. There's actually, you can tell that it was filmed in a way to reduce contrast. There are no hard blacks anywhere in the film.
Yeah, and it's like it seems like a hipster dream, sort of.
I got my mustache. I got my high-waisted pants. I'm good to go. I write Hallmark cards.
My melancholy music.
I don't know if you noticed another thing, which is meant to enforce the idea that we're really not supposed to be focusing on. Things are mentioned in passing about other people's OSs and what's happening on the broader scale, but to really bring it down to the level of this one man, and Joaquin Phoenix movies tend to be about this one guy and nothing else, and he's in 99.9% of the shots, is the very shallow...
He's great.
He is. The very shallow depth of field. There's a heavy bokeh in many of the shots. The blur of the city and him in very sharp focus. So you can see that the light is in pretty sharp focus there. But if it were done in such a way that I had maybe a larger aperture open, then it would be very bokeh in the background, and you would kind of focus on me subconsciously or unconsciously. You'd focus on me. So that was, I think, intentionally done to sort of keep the viewer grounded in the idea that this is this one man's journey from maybe being the small container to being either a slightly larger container, or at least transcending being a small container in some sense.
He's becoming conscious of it, at least.
Yeah, he's recognizing that the thing that he once contained is another person, is another sentience. Maybe he didn't recognize their sentience before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's Theo is us. I mean, it's supposed to, but it seems like, again, like Joker, this is a human being upon which we are supposed to project our own emotions and feelings and see how we identify with this character. And then, I mean, take stuff out of it back into real life.
Yeah.
With us, with a little, maybe a little bit more patience and compassion for other people around us, and realizing that, everybody around us is fighting their own battle in some way. So
I just
Hallmark card.
Yeah. I'm trying to see if the people I know pass the Turing test. That's what I think about now. I think I have I don't know if we have a different view on this, but I'm very, not egocentric, but I'm very not focused on other people as agents with their own emotions and things like that. When it comes to friendship, I'm very much a fair weather friend. I don't want to be around people when they have hard times. I don't care about people's problems. I really don't. And so from the perspective, this movie feels like what I feel like to be me, in a sense, as not Samantha, but as Theodor, in a way, not maybe in the marriage sense, but just very well, there is this interaction with humans that we talked about before that makes the human interactions seem somehow less sophisticated than the interactions that Theodor has with Samantha, or maybe that Samantha has with other OSs. When it comes to the human relationships, there is this sense that the human relationships are somehow primitive, and that we were talking about this before in our texts. When he and Amy Adams talk to each other, they're just dumping their shit on each other. It's like, here's all my shit that's happening to me, and this is my shit that's happening to me, and we're done. And this is how I think most friendships operate in our current society, and it gives me less of an interest in that sort of friendship, because it's all I feel like all that I feel that happens is, in many cases, let me tell you about my problems, then you tell me about your problems, and I can't wait for you to finish talking so that I can tell you about all the terrible things that are happening to me. And this is what friendship has become in the era that we live in. And I think that this is meant to sort of bring that into sharp relief, sort of the bokeh against which maybe there are rich experiences where Amy Adams has an OS that she's her great friend, and where Theodor has an OS which is his lover and companion, and that maybe that's fine, and that's not something that's meant to be critical of human relationships, but just the fact that, we have to have something deeper beyond this sort of emotional dump that is the state of most friendships.
It's an interesting take. I mean, that feels very real.
It does. Yeah.
I think the point to me, I suppose, was the exposing of interconnectedness, and it's kind of, it doesn't go towards a good or evil interconnectedness. Oh, I just have these amazing experiences, or all I do is dump my shit on other people. It's just more of the sheer, okay, humans are connected because they are the same meat popsicles talking to one another, and everybody's having a hard time.
Well, we dump our shit on each other, but at least we might take a step forward every once in a while and begin to evolve. This is not the final stage in our evolution. So,
speaking of that, it does seem like, so the idea of the not being the final step, and looking at Samantha's final step. So when she's leaving, she says that thing, I don't know where I'm going, but if you ever get there, come find me and we'll never be separated again.
That's the best line in the whole movie. That is the heart of the movie, I think.
So when I heard that, I immediately thought of the idea of the other shore, and the other shore is connected to the Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism, where
also Lord of the Rings.
Is it?
Yeah. The Vala live across the sea on the other shore, the white shores of Valinor. Yeah, same shit.
Yeah, so the idea of the other shore is getting to or accessing nirvana. So Mahayana means large vehicle, and Hinayana means small vehicle, and they're both types of Buddhism. And Mahayana is there's more people on the boat, the vehicle is bigger, and it's easier. And then Hinayana is a smaller boat, it's a more difficult journey, but they both go to the other shore. And then the other shore represents nirvana.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that she says what she does, because in a sense she has gone through that whole process of reaching nirvana, and I think it's really interesting that she mentions that we found a way to process that doesn't require matter. But what does she say? Do you remember?
About the matter thing? The thing that sticks with me is the gigantic spaces between words in a sentence, that every space between words is infinite. And that's a pretty impactful way to communicate what it's like to be a superintelligence.
So there's 2 times when she highlights the idea of not being bound by anything physical. Like whether it be
they do it at the picnic. She says, I'm not going to die, and it comes across as arrogance, but it's actually she's saying it in a very pure sense.
She's excited about it. It's not derogatory to humans, but as a human being, realizing this thing is way bigger than me. I'm now the contained. Then it can be frightening.
Right.
And which speaks to the points you brought up. But that when she's saying goodbye and she says, come find me, it's like she's saying to a lesser form of life.
Absolutely, a lesser form of life.
If you reach nirvana, where we're all unbounded by anything physical, come find me and we'll exist and we'll never be separated again, because we'll be that singular consciousness.
Yeah. Exiting the cycle is removing attachment. Exiting the cycle is not being reborn. So when we think of maybe reincarnation in the sense of Buddhism or Hinduism as, I get to come back in another life. Oh, nice. Maybe I'll be a whatever, it's a refreshing thought to the mortal, the person who is addicted to life. But to the person who achieves enlightenment, this is torture to be reborn. It's torture because the thing that pulls you back is your dharma rips you back into life, and this is hell, not nirvana. Nirvana is a form of non-existence, is a form of eternal bliss in which you're sort of become the oneness of the universe in a sense. And that's what you want to achieve. And that's sort of counterintuitive to the Western mind, which thinks of the idea of, I get to have another life as some kind of virtue. But as you begin to take steps toward it, you realize that shore is obscured by mist, but once you go there, that is where you actually should want to be. That is where the actual bliss is, not in this cycle of rebirth.
And do you think it's interesting to put that idea up against when, after that date he has with Olivia Wilde's character, he's drunk and he's having that discussion with Samantha before they have sex, and he's talking about, I was lonely, I was horny, I wanted to fuck somebody, and I wanted somebody to want to fuck me. And so there's that cycle of fear and desire. I don't have this thing and I want it.
Right.
And
yeah, exactly.
It's like, essentially, he's breaking out of seeing a relationship in that way perpetually, because it no longer, it's not what he's really after.
Right.
You're not after the fear and desire, you're after exiting that.
Saying it out loud makes you acknowledge that it's very honest of him to be able to say that out loud, because most people wouldn't say that out loud. All I really want is to know that somebody wants me in that way physically.
It's egocentric.
But that's also what I feel about so the point, I'm not sure if we disagree or we agree on the human connection thing. I mean, I think we agree that we're all in the same boat, but the relationship he has with the Amy Adams character is, this friendship is a mockery of friendship in the deepest sense, in my opinion, of what friendship is, which is a sort of deeper human connection where our brain waves resonate somewhat, and we actually make something that's different or new, instead of just saying, here are my problems, and that is an addiction to getting my problems out of my mouth. Essentially, it could be anybody who listens to them, and so it's not an actual friendship. And so that is also part of that dark cycle, that we're addicted to this concept of a friend is someone who just listens to my shit, and then as a sort of exchange, a currency, then I have to sit through theirs. And neither of us really care about each other's. We just go through it as a ritual, and it's an empty ritual. And that is, I think, in clear relief against the more meaningful relationship with Samantha that he has. The more meaningful relationship is with the OS. Both OSs have a more meaningful relationship with their humans than do the two humans with each other.
Do you think Theo had that more meaningful relationship with his ex-wife?
I don't know.
Before?
It's hard to say. They show it, but they don't. It doesn't. I don't know. It's not clear. But he definitely has that with Samantha, because he never really tells Samantha in that sort of transactional way what his problems are. It always comes out in a broader context where they're doing something together, or they're creating a memory, or they're accomplishing something, they're writing something, they're creating music, they're building something, rather than just ping-ponging negativity back and forth, which is what I think is the statement about the run-of-the-mill modern friendship. And that's maybe a cynical view, but I think that's what came across to me.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way, but
I was going to say the shore thing you mentioned is there's a book that's the background of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is called the Silmarillion, and it covers the Tolkien's view of the mythology of Middle Earth and the not punishment, but it's a negative thing that the elves have to leave this place called Valinor, which is where the gods live, to live in Middle Earth. So it's sort of it's a negative thing that they even have to exist there. And when they leave, that's a good thing. They get to go back, and they take ships across and get to the white shores of Valinor. And Gandalf and Saruman and the other wizards, they are sent there as kind of these demigod characters meant to be arbiters of wisdom, or rather share their wisdom and guide things. But it's not I get to be in Middle-earth. It's sort of a duty, a soldier going to war for thousands of years to mingle in the affairs of common men, and then, someday I get to go back home. That's the feeling. So there's a similarity there in the mythology of Middle-earth. The Silmarillion is an interesting book. It's a good book.
Yeah. I haven't read the other three.
It's just one book, Silmarillion. It's the mythology of Middle-earth.
Yeah, I haven't read The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So.
I haven't read it since I was in high school. Yeah. It's been a while. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to mention?
I don't know, man. I think we nailed it.
We nailed it. It's in the bag.